I'm surprised no one told Joe Rogan that his material was not the best.
Joe Rogan's comedy special is what happens when you don't have any real friends.
This special is terrible and beyond salvaging.
I'll be honest, this special was pretty disappointing.
I like the content, I don't like the delivery.
What's up, everybody? Ty Rivera here, the absolute best LGBTQ comedian in the world. Okay, so it's exactly 2 weeks ago as of recording this that Joe Rogan took time out of being the biggest podcaster in the world to record a comedy special for Netflix to remind us why he's the biggest podcaster in the world. Before we really get started, I'm going to tell you that I saw a video by Elephant Graveyard, which is a channel here on YouTube that is absolutely amazing, full of sarcasm, great editing, everything about that video is perfect. But the first video I saw was from Comedy Enforcement, and Comedy Enforcement is a channel I've been watching for a while. He asked some questions in his video, and that's what inspired me to make this. I've been really busy the last 2 weeks, so it took me a while to get around to it, but I did watch the full special, which is part of what held me up, was that I wanted to see the full special before I actually commented on it, because how are you going to review something that you haven't actually seen? I mean, I could go off other people's opinions, but what do I think of it as a stand-up comedian? Because for anybody that doesn't know, full disclosure, I was a regular at the Comedy Mothership for about a year. So I do have some insight on the way that the club works, and I also have been doing stand-up for 21 years, and I do undeniably know the mechanics of stand-up comedy. So here's what the deal is. Some people online are saying this is a terrible special, and other people are saying it's not that bad. There are far more that are saying that it's terrible than there are the not that bad. But unpopular opinion, I think both of them are correct. Because as far as it being a special goes, it was terrible. But as far as it being just a regular set, it wasn't that bad. And I know some of you are going to refer back to the beginning when I said that Joe Rogan doesn't have any real friends.
And if you don't have good comedian friends, it's hard to know what the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do.
And that would be true. As a person that has been in that world, I know that Joe Rogan has friends like the kid in school that had the nicest car and access to all the cool stuff.
The only friends he has left just kiss his ass and tell him he's amazing. That's the only explanation for him thinking this was his greatest set of all time.
That's what Joe Rogan is. And when you're a person that's in that position, people don't want to upset the apple cart. People don't want to tell you that what you're doing isn't necessarily groundbreaking and isn't even what you can consider to be good.
It's just lazy. He's just repeating the same hack material that right-wing comedians have been joking about for the past 15 years.
But I halfway expected that, even though I was hoping that he would prove me wrong, because going to see a Joe Rogan comedy special and expecting him to be good at stand-up makes as much sense to me as going to see Britney Spears and expecting her to be a good singer. Now, I love Britney Spears, but I know she's not a singer, just like some of you may love Joe Rogan. But more than likely, if you know stand-up at all, you know he's not a stand-up comedian. And that's one thing that has always bothered me about him, because occasionally I would either watch his podcast or I would see clips on different channels that I watch here on YouTube, and he would always be talking about stand-up comedy, waxing poetic about the process of stand-up comedy. And the whole time I would just be watching like, you're not even that good at stand-up comedy. I don't know why you're constantly talking about the process. Also, have you guys paid attention to interviews with any other really big and really good comics? They don't usually spend all their time talking about the process of stand-up comedy.
Like seriously, I've never seen somebody endlessly analyze the intricacies of making people laugh as much as Rogan does.
Because when it comes down to it, yes, there is a process to it, and yes, it is an art form, but at the same time, it's not as deep as he's always trying to make it, unless you are a very color by numbers comedian that isn't naturally funny. And that's what the problem is with Joe Rogan. That's why when you watch his podcast and other comedians tell him jokes, he either doesn't laugh or he'll do that stupid sound where he'll be like, "Ah!" And that's him trying to figure out if that's where he's supposed to laugh. So that's why he makes that sound like, I'm not going to fully commit to a laugh, but I'm going to make a sound so that I can judge off of the comedian's reactions whether or not I was supposed to actually laugh at that point. That's what's happening with Joe Rogan, if you guys didn't know how to read that. And watching him during his special, just the being loud for no apparent reason, it's like,
If everything is yelled, then you can't emphasize anything.
And that's just the way that speech works. And I know that he's very well known for his situation with Carlos Mencia, but I have always maintained, I think that the reason he made the big deal with Carlos Mencia was because him and Carlos Mencia basically do the same kind of stand-up comedy, which is loud and really no point and really no depth to it. And Carlos Mencia was the person that was in his way. Carlos Mencia was the big one at that time. So he came up with this idea that he was going to come after Carlos Mencia for joke stealing, which everybody already knew Carlos Mencia was doing. That was well known throughout the industry at that time. Not a secret. For years, everybody had known that. But Rogan decided to make that his cause so that he could take Carlos Mencia out of the way. That is truly the way I feel about that situation, because really there was no other reason for him to come in and white knight that way. I don't believe that Joe Rogan is really that much in support of other comedians, and that part does come from my own personal dealings with Joe Rogan and watching the way things work around his club. And then the other thing he was doing during his special was he was just overselling everything and making a bunch of faces, sort of like a precocious 9-year-old on a 90s sitcom. And it's like, are you having a stroke right now? Or what's happening that you're making all these stupid faces throughout your entire special? Does your material not stand on its own enough that you can't just do a joke and not have to make some ridiculous expression? And I really think that a lot of that is to cover up the fact that Joe Rogan is now basically just doing what he claims to hate about woke comedians or SJW comedians.
You get these groups of people that they huddle up in these echo chambers.
And I think it's ironic that Joe Rogan would say that, because he is just the opposite side of the coin. He really is just going out of his way to say things that he thinks are going to be edgy or he thinks are going to push buttons. But it's almost a mere reflection of what the woke is, where instead of actually doing jokes, you just make a series of statements that are going to be popular for the intended audience, and then they clap more than they laugh. And that's what we used to call clapter, which, if you notice, that's what was going on during his special. There was a lot of people like clapping, like, yeah, we're in support of this, but there wasn't a lot of heavy laughter like you would expect when somebody's doing a special. Because when you're doing a special, and especially if you're someone like Joe Rogan that took 6 years between this special and his last special, which I never fault anybody for the amount of time they take between specials, because it does take a long time to come up with stuff that you want actually immortalized, to actually craft things in a way that you think is going to present for that moment in time what was your best stuff, you putting your best foot forward. And I know that Rogan really does work to craft his material, but the ceiling's kind of low for him in the way of actual stand-up, because he is not naturally inclined to be funny. And so you can spend years meticulously crafting a turd, but at the end, all you're going to have is a meticulously crafted turd. And another giveaway when it came to him just trying to pander to the audience was he opened talking about Buc-ee's, which, if you guys aren't familiar with Buc-ee's is a chain of truck stops that they have here in Texas, and they have everything at Buc-ee's. I was just at Buc-ee's last night because I was performing, ironically enough, in San Antonio, which is the city Joe shot his special in. And on my way back, I stopped at the Buc-ee's, and they have shirts, they have food, they have everything you can imagine at Buc-ee's. It really is pretty amazing. But that was just him pandering to the audience and trying to let them know that he's now officially a Texan, which is something that you do when you're on the road as a comedian. In certain cases, you'll find out what's popular in town or what's a common landmark that people will relate to, and you do that to ingratiate yourself to the audience, which is what Joe Rogan was doing when he brought up Buc-ee's. There was really no reason. Then also, there were at least 2 instances where he used old jokes from old specials.
Maybe he forgot his material, panicked, and then started doing old jokes, because throughout the special he actually retold at least 2 jokes word for word,
which that's not something people usually do. And I think Comedy Enforcement was right when they suggested that he might have panicked, because the other thing about Joe Rogan is that as much as he talks about his process and his discipline, he's really not very disciplined at all. He mainly goes to the mothership to hang out and to be around his friends. And after it's all said and done, you would expect him to know that it really didn't didn't go that well. But this is how you know that people aren't being honest with him, and most importantly, he isn't being honest with himself, because a couple days later, he had Adam Sandler on JRE, and during that episode, he was telling Adam Sandler,
I prepared for 5 hours the day of the show.
Wow.
Just watching video. I went to the gym. In the gym, I'm listening to my
to
set.
your own shit, yes.
Yeah, I'm just like, I want to be just dialed
I get
in.
like that, yeah.
100% dialed in.
how dialed in he felt. And it's like, that was terrible. How could you think that that was you dialed in? If I had a set like that on what was supposed to be my special, I would immediately check into rehab. And I don't even do anything that would get me put in rehab, but I would lie and just be like, you guys, my life has spiraled out of control. I hadn't realized it and gotten this carried away, and I need some time alone. And that's what he should have done, was just buried his head for a little while, or at least acknowledge that, okay, things didn't go according to plan. Things didn't go the way that I thought they would. Maybe I'm not the comedian I thought that I was. But that's something Joe Rogan would never be able to do, because in his mind, he really does believe that he is a great comedian. And the fact that he's not was evidenced when he had Cat Williams on JRE, and he said the thing about only 500 or 250 comedians that were actually good at it and elite, and Cat Williams was just looking at him like,
Talked about this the other day. There's maybe 500 of us on the planet. You know, you got to be real generous and say 500, because it's really probably about 250.
Right.
But legit comics,
you think you're a part of that? And everybody watching felt like, yeah, you're not one of those comedians, Joe Rogan. You may have fooled yourself into believing that you're one of those comedians because you've made a lot of money through podcasting. And through that audience, you've been able to tour and be very successful. And I know he was touring before he had JRE, but he was never a really good comedian. That's why he's always bought his friends. That's what he does now with Mothership. That's what he was doing back then. If you saw Ari Shaffir talk about him on Tucker Carlson.
And Rogan was always passing money around.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he kept me in business for a long time.
Rogan did?
And also never touched my wallet and went out to the finest restaurants.
And that's something a lot of comedians that are really successful but not really good at stand-up will do, because they know that other comedians won't be honest about them because they don't want to lose that check. They don't want to lose the opportunity for that money. And in Joe Rogan's case specifically, they don't want to lose access to the mothership. Also, when Comedy Enforcement mentioned that Joe Rogan had started his own thing here in Austin so that cancel culture wouldn't really be a thing.
But also, according to Joe Rogan himself, one of the reasons why he opened his own club and started his own comedy scene in Austin was so that him and other comedians could have a place where they could perform comedy without having to worry about getting canceled or upsetting the club owners and then getting kicked out or losing the gig.
Well, that's not really the way it went down. Joe Rogan and Tony Hinchcliffe wanted to be in charge of cancel culture. That's why when I was vocal about things not working at the club the way that they were supposed to work, which I'll tag that video up here, but when I was open about that, the manager of Mothership immediately got on the phone with the Creek and other clubs in town and let them know that they didn't want me performing at those clubs. So I, in essence, got canceled by Joe Rogan and his club. Also, I have a friend named Leonardo Joni. She actually shared a reel, which was a clip of me talking about the Mothership. So they use that as an excuse to cancel my friend Leonardo, when Leonardo is actually funny. She's got a decent following of her own. Her stand-up comedy is in line with the same kind of thinking as Joe Rogan. There are so many things that make her perfect for that club, but just because she shared something that they considered to be offensive, they went out of their way to basically cancel her. She was immediately banned from the Mothership, which is the antithesis of what Joe Rogan, Tony Hinchcliffe, and many of the others claim to be about. So as far as cancel culture goes, it was not to make sure that cancel culture wasn't an issue for comedians. It was to make sure that they were in charge of cancel culture and cancel culture didn't negatively affect them. And the truth is, if you're funny enough, if you have a point and if you have depth, you don't actually have to worry about getting canceled because your joke is completely defensible. You can just be like, yeah, this is the point I was making with that joke. That's one of the biggest problems for people like Tony Hinchcliffe and Joe Rogan, is none of their jokes are based on actual life experience. None of their their jokes have any actual depth to them, so they're pretty indefensible when people come after them for using the words that they're using, because really there's no point to anything they're saying. So there is no deeper conversation to be had there. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, I just used those words to be shocking. So when you're a merchant of outrage, you can't be surprised when you get canceled. Because I personally say all sorts of things that I should be canceled for, and I welcome the conversations that would come with that. I don't mind people recording me. The only time I ask people to stop recording me is when they're recording me for too long and I start to feel creeped out, because then it starts to stilt my performance, because I'm like, why is this person recording my entire set? Why don't they just enjoy the moment? So in that way, I understand why they have the phones locked away at Mothership, but at the same time, I really do think it's kind of a bitch move and kind of a cop-out that people like Tony Hinchcliffe and Joe Rogan are afraid to have people record anything that they say. It just seems to me like the person that's hiding on their porch but talking a lot of shit, it's like, well, come off the porch. If you're really as brave as you're pretending to be, you're supposed to be...
We say, in the comedy world, we say we're the last line of defense.
You're supposed to be the wall to woke.
Where the woke meets the wall.
And again, whether Joe wants to admit it or not, he really has created his own echo chamber. Joe Rogan is basically a hypocrite, and if you really pay attention, that's easy to notice. And I know, again, that a lot of you are going to call me a hater, but facts are facts, and this is what it is. Also, when Comedy Enforcement mentioned that maybe his club is set up in a way to be the best for comedians and the best for comedy, and that kind of handicaps you, because on top of that, people are already happy to see Rogan and excited about seeing him.
The way that Joe Rogan runs the club, it's pretty much the most comfortable and the safest spots for a comedian to perform comedy at. And I'm actually curious what other comedians think about that, if it's good or bad. And I mean, I'm sure no one will ever say that it's a bad spot, but I wonder if long term, if it affects people's comedy, or if it just sets unrealistic expectations, because again, everyone that goes to the Mothership has been waiting for months, to get tickets, and they're just happy to be there.
It's almost like being a guest in someone's home. If you go to somebody's home and they happen to do some kind of performance or sing, maybe they have a karaoke machine set up. Of course, if you're a guest in their home, you're going to clap, you're going to go crazy, you're going to act like it was the best thing ever, because you don't want to be rude in their home. So Rogan can't necessarily get a good gauge of what he's doing by the audience at the Comedy Mothership, because they don't want to come off as rude. And as far as the club itself goes, it is perfect. Like the way he set it up, the sound there, the way that the seats are arranged, everything about that club is perfect. But if you're one of the more well-known people there, it does create this false sense of you think that you're better than you are, because this audience is already prepped for you. The circumstances are perfect. There are no variables there that really recreate what it's like to be an actual stand-up. For a person like me, it was cool to perform there because not as many people know me. So there would sometimes be people that recognize me there from either YouTube or one of the other clubs in Austin, or Kill Tony, to be 100% honest. But I didn't have to worry about walking on stage and having the audience be too easy on me, because there would still be a fair amount of people there that didn't know who I was, which to me was an ideal circumstance for using that room to get better, which is what Joe Rogan has said that room's for. But the longer I live in Austin and see the way things work, even from afar, the more I realize that it really was just all designed to stroke Joe Rogan, Tony Hinchcliffe, and a few of their other friends' egos, and make it so that they feel like superstars every night, and in a sense get to lie to themselves and pretend that they're actually doing stand-up comedy when they're not really doing stand-up comedy. So they give themselves a lot of credit and a lot of pats on the back, like they're really doing stand-up at that club, but it really is the stand-up comedy equivalent of T-ball. The other thing that happens at the Comedy Mothership is security there is great. Security is top-notch, and I've always been clear about the fact that I had a really great relationship with all the security that worked there. But security is so great that if anybody tries to heckle or anybody gets out of line, it immediately gets shut down, which also will hinder you as a stand-up comedian comedian because in a way you do need some of that. Like I would go up last when I was there, and security knew because I was very friendly with all of them that during my set I didn't want them to get rid of anybody for heckling. Since I was going last, it wasn't like the next comedian was going to have to deal with the heckler. I was the last person on stage. So I had asked them to please not get rid of anybody unless it was absolutely necessary, unless it was something they had to do for the good of the club so that the club wouldn't lose their license or anything like that. Obviously, I wouldn't get in the way of that or even try to get in the way of that. And so I let them know that under almost all circumstances, just allow whatever happens to happen. And that's what real stand-up comedy is. And that's what Joe Rogan's problem is he really isn't a stand-up comedian. At this point, Joe Rogan is a stand-up comedian the same way that TikTok celebrities are stand-up comedians when they put on shows in stand-up clubs. People will say, oh, they're doing stand-up. And it's like, yeah, kind of they are doing stand-up, but really they're just selling a bunch of tickets and doing a personal appearance, which I have no problem with that. I understand the way the game works. I understand that these clubs have to make money, but I'm not going to mistake that for stand-up comedy, just like I wouldn't with Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan will always be what Joe Rogan is, which is a really successful podcaster. And so when you couple the fact that he's already not naturally good at stand-up, and then he's basically playing t-ball over at his own club because everything's set up in his favor, of course you're going to end up with a mediocre comedy special, which is what it was. It was a mediocre at best comedy special. I also don't give him credit when people are like, most comedians will record it and have it edited and do 3 or 4 shows, and all of that is true. But you forget, stand-up comedy is something we do live. So I don't necessarily give somebody credit just because they did their special live. Technically, you should be able to have an amazing special while doing it live, especially if you're Joe Rogan, because a lot of times what happens with celebrities on Joe Rogan's level is that when you first walk on stage, the audience is so excited to see you that it doesn't really matter what you say. All you have to do is be minimally funny and the audience is going to go crazy. The audience is going to love it. So the odds are stacked in your favor. So there is nothing impressive about Joe Rogan recording this live and calling it Burn the Boats. He should have called it Burn the Set List, or he should have called it Burn All His Friends, because he should definitely be mad at some of the people that he hangs out with, even though I know he hangs out with Tony Hinchcliffe. That's like one of his biggest confidants. And when you have Joe Rogan and Tony Hinchcliffe helping each other out when it comes to stand-up, that's not necessarily going to provide the best results, because I will give it to you, Joe Rogan and Tony Hinchcliffe are 2 of the okayest comics in the country, possibly the world. But exactly like I said, with no sarcasm, they are 2 of the okayest stand-up comedians in the country, possibly the world right now. So if that's who he's bouncing things off of, that's not necessarily going to yield the best special, because neither of them are the best comedians. And some of you will say Tony Hinchcliffe has the most popular live podcast, Kill Tony is amazing, and that's great. But Tony Hinchcliffe is so great at stand-up that he had to create his own genre so he could seem like he was special. That's why he calls himself a roast comedian. Well, spoiler alert, most of us do roast. If you're a good comedian, roasting is a part of your arsenal. But none of us would call ourselves roast comedians because that's a side to what you do. Stand-up is what you actually do. And if you watch Tony Hinchcliffe's sets, he's not a great stand-up comedian. Some people are going to say I'm hating, but these are just things that any actual comedian would tell you if they were being completely honest about it and not at all worried about being ostracized from the Austin comedy scene or from Joe Rogan's circle. I personally chose not to be a part of that, so I don't mind saying what I'm going to say. And the truth of the matter is, Joe Rogan at a point stopped even trying to be a comedian and just became more of a gimmick and a caricature of what he's supposed to be or what he actually was. That's why he talked about all the things that he's supposed to talk about. Conspiracy theory, transgenderism, all the stuff he talked about is just stuff that you talk about if you're trying to let everybody know that you're trying to be edgy. And I know I call myself an LGBTQ comedian, but the truth is I am so far from politically correct or anything woke that I have no problem with the content of what Joe did on its face. I was not at all offended. It just wasn't good. But Joe Rogan figured out at some point what a lot of his his crew has figured out. And that's that it's easier to be a gimmick than it is to be an actual comedian. Because if you're an actual comedian, it could take you years to get anywhere. If you are a gimmick, then you quickly go somewhere because you're saying all the stuff that your audience wants to hear from you. Like Bert Kreischer was just a regular comedian. And if you ask me, a much better comedian before he became the Machine. And then once he became the Machine, suddenly he became this gimmick and now he's selling out arenas. His stand-up isn't the best, but all he has to do is take off his shirt and everybody goes wild, and that's easier than actually crafting jokes. There are a few others I could call out, but why bother? The internet does it daily with some of them. And then when it came to one of the jokes that people said was actually his own and said was okay was the one about how you don't talk to the president of the lake before you go fishing. And supposedly that's a ripoff of one of Kathleen Madigan's jokes, which Kathleen Madigan is absolutely hilarious. I haven't personally verified that, but that's one of the things that I read was that it seemed to be a ripoff of a Kathleen Madigan joke. So take that for what it's worth. Then also he had the joke about Fear Factor, and that joke I heard 20 years ago when he was performing at the Comedy Store when I first saw him. Again, I don't think Joe Rogan is terrible at comedy. I just don't think he's good at comedy. And anytime anybody thinks Joe Rogan actually loves stand-up comedy, remember that Joe Rogan was the one that talked Brendan Schaub into doing stand-up comedy. Which Brendan Schaub, yeah, his comedy is pretty terrible, but what you forget about that situation is Joe Rogan pulled a lot of strings to fast-track Brendan Schaub and got him in a lot of places that he hadn't necessarily earned his way into. But Joe used his influence to get Brendan Schaub into these spots and headline at clubs across the country that he really shouldn't have been headlining. And what people don't understand about that is when that happens, that takes an opportunity from another stand-up comedian that probably went at it the honest way, and now Brendan Schaub, just by being friends with Joe Rogan, has worked his way into taking that spot. And I don't think that that's something that you would do if you really love stand-up comedy. Also, that didn't turn out to be the best strategy for Brendan Schaub himself, as he turned out to pretty well flop completely in stand-up comedy and now is retired from stand-up comedy. And that is probably because since Joe Rogan fast-tracked him, he really didn't put in the work. And who knows, maybe he could have been okay at stand-up comedy. I know everybody's just dead set on Brendan Schaub is terrible and he was just destined to be terrible, but I don't necessarily know that that's the case if him and Rogan had used the combination of not only Rogan's connections, but also had him put in the hard work and go to actual open mics, go do things that none of us want to do at the beginning of stand-up comedy, but because we don't have a connection, we have to do them. And then after you've done them, you're like, yes, that is why I'm actually good at what I do. Case in point, me. Last night, I did 2 shows in San Antonio. You can ask any audience that's ever seen me perform before. I am actually good at what I do. But it was from years and years of performing under the worst circumstances where nobody knew my name. Nobody knows my name in some cases now. I have no problem admitting that, but I actually do pride myself on the fact that I can take audiences that have never heard of me, have no idea what I do, and absolutely destroy in those rooms and have no problem getting booked there again or getting booked for something else from people seeing those performances. And that's what a comedian like Brendan Schaub loses when they get fast-tracked by one of their friends that happens to have some clout, especially as much clout as Joe Rogan does. So to get back to the special, there was one point where I thought Joe Rogan had a chance of winning them back, and it's not like he was bombing, but he just wasn't doing particularly well. And that was his Elon Musk joke, where he compares his and Elon's relationship to basically being like the movie A Boy and His Dog, because Rogan is so dumb, and that's the premise of the joke. That's not me saying he's so dumb. But because Rogan is so dumb and Elon is so smart, and he makes that comparison. Well, if you notice, during that joke at the very beginning, what happens is he mentions Elon Musk, the audience starts to woohoo, and he doesn't adjust for his timing, so that gets lost, and it basically kills the momentum that that joke actually should have, which I've seen him do that joke before in Vegas. I saw him do it at MGM Grand Garden because I happened to be there to watch another friend of mine perform, guest list. But yeah, and so I'd seen him do that, and it had gone really well there. But because he didn't adjust his timing, because he didn't slow down, because he wasn't actually in the moment, that's why I kind of have a problem with him talking about how dialed dialed in he was is because if he had been dialed in as a comedian, he would have known that woohoo was stepping on people hearing him. So what you do is you either pause and then repeat that part, or you pause and adjust for it, however you adjust, whether that's repeating it or taking a beat and then rephrasing it. But whatever you do, that's something that you do in the moment as a comedian. There's a part of me that doesn't fault him for that because that'll happen in live performance, but there's a part of me that really does when he's talking about how dialed in he is. If you're so dialed in, then you should have noticed that and been able to correct it in real time. So then towards the end of it, at 55 minutes and 49 seconds, that's where he goes into a joke where he says he's 1.6% African, which technically should have been a bigger joke for him, but the audience was losing steam and he kind of got them back, but it really didn't work out the way that I'm sure he planned that it would. And that ended up being pretty close to the end of his set, and it just made for an all the way around disappointing special. So when people are saying that it's not good, I just think that Joe Rogan's heart really isn't in stand-up, and when people joke and say that somebody should give him the same speech that he gave Brendan Schaub about UFC and how he's not really in it anymore and he probably should just quit, I think that the internet is basically telling him that now. What happened with Joe Rogan was a true live version of The Emperor's New Clothes, except for instead of the little kid telling the Emperor that he wasn't wearing any clothes, it really was almost every person that saw his Netflix special being like, yeah, this guy is naked up there. This guy is not the master craftsman of stand-up comedy that he pretends to be. So like I've already said, I know some of you are gonna tell me that I'm just being a hater and I'm jealous of Joe Rogan and whatever else, and to tell you the truth, I'm not jealous of anybody. I'm just being 100% honest from a comedian's point of view that actually does know the way things work in that particular part of the stand-up comedy world. So have your feelings, go ahead and cope however you have to cope, because your boy turned out not to be the stand-up comedian he's been lying to you about being on his podcast for the last however many years. Except that you've been had, you've been fooled, you bought in, and now you look stupid. Anyway, let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. Like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to comment just to help me on the algorithm, but you don't know what to comment, just put a knife, because Joe Rogan himself is probably going to come for my neck. As always, this has been Ty Rivera, the absolute best LGBTQ comedian in the world.
They bought into his bullshit.
Also, when he was talking to Cat Williams, he mentioned that there's only so many comics that you want to hang out with that are cool to hang out with.
Guys you want to hang out with? Guys who are fun?
Which, if you know anything about actual stand-up comics, they're not usually the coolest to hang out with. In some cases, they're awkward. In some cases, they're kind of assholes. Case in point, Bill Burr also kind of seems like an asshole at points. And I don't say this in a rude way, but just if you watch interviews with him, he'll usually get short with people. He'll usually cut people off. Louis C.K. is also very blunt and will cut people off. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that that's something a lot of stand-up comedians are like. So the fact that Joe Rogan has somehow found all of the cool ones to hang out with probably says a little bit more about what they're like as stand-up comedians than what they're like as people. Because you can find good people around every corner. Good stand-up comedians, not as common.
Some of the premises, or a lot of the premises, were also recycled premises. I couldn't find examples of them, but you know, they sounded very familiar, either something he said on a podcast.
But when it comes to him recycling things from the podcast, I don't really see anything wrong with that. I think a lot of people that have podcasts will use things that they said on the podcast because they think they're funny. It doesn't necessarily make them great jokes, and it doesn't necessarily make them great comparisons. Like when he said the joke about the lesbian having a strap on and thinking that's the same as her having a being like him having a lighter and thinking that that makes him a dragon. The phrasing for that would be off, because she's not claiming that having a strap on turns her into a man. So the comparison doesn't necessarily work. And that may be me being a comedy nerd, but that's what being a good comic is being a little bit of a nerd, is fact checking your jokes. And sometimes it sucks because you'll have a joke you really liked, but you just can't figure out the phrasing, or it wouldn't be factually accurate. And so in those cases, I guess you could take comedic license and say it anyway, but it never feels like it's as good of a joke as it should be when you have to go out of your way to use comedic license instead of just making the joke actually work. This joke he could have worked on the phrasing of, but he's told it for quite a while thinking that it's really clever. It just lets you know the level of comedian that Joe Rogan actually is.